catch them up. All right, it's official 1, 2, 3, go. Here we are. Welcome everyone to New Moon Stories. This is number 8 in the series, which kind of blows me away a little bit. We started these last September, and we've had guests come and visitors come and share their stories with us and listen and comment, and it's a wonderful thing to have. Stories come in all sizes and shapes, and I was thinking about this one today. I can't remember if it was an exam question or what, but it was some university class was told to write a story that involved drama, sex, religion, and mystery in as few words as possible. And the winning story was 8 words long. Oh my God, I'm pregnant. Whose is it? And we have 2 guests tonight. I'm glad to have both of them. Shirley Godfrey is joining us from Storytellers of Canada. She's in Dartmouth. And my friend and neighbor and counselor, Barb Longva from up south of Smoky, is here too to join us. And maybe we'll start with Shirley, since she looks sort of, well, vulnerable. He is a member of the Storytellers of Canada, Contour Canadien. Would you like to tell us a bit about that, Shirley, and then launch?
Okay. I'm sort of an accidental storyteller. I tend to sit in the back of the room and take notes, and then I can tell Storytellers of Canada what I heard. And it's, but I'm also the family historian and genealogist, which means I've gathered a lot of stories over the years. And I had been trying to get them written up and things. And several years ago, I was in a coffee shop with my daughter one day, and we saw a poster for storytellers and an event that was happening that evening. So she decided we were having a mother-daughter event, and we went to Storytellers Circle of Halifax. And anyway, a year later, she quit. I didn't. I continued listening. And a couple of years later, I went to my first conference for Storytellers of Canada. Several of the members of the Halifax Storytellers Circle are members of Storytellers of Canada, and we're founding members of it. And so they kind of sparked our interest in actually going to a conference. I went to a few more. And on my way, I think to the 3rd or 4th, Linda, who was then the representative for Nova Scotia for Storytellers of Canada, asked me to do a favor because she couldn't go to the conference. Please deliver this to the meeting. I delivered a t-shirt to the meeting and found out I was the new rep for Nova Scotia. So, that is my story of how I became a representative for Nova Scotia to Storytellers of Canada. And my main job basically is to try to tell the rest of the nation about storytelling here in Nova Scotia, which is fun. It means I have an excuse to go visit festivals and events. And when I find out about them, I'm in there like a dirty shirt and making notes. And then I send my little notes off to other people. So that is my job.
You've attended New Moon Stories several times, and I remember seeing you sitting back in the corner taking notes.
Yes.
And so I sent you a note and said, would you like to be a guest? And you said, I'm interested but intimidated. And then you left the diving board and jumped right in, and thank you for doing that.
Yes. Well, it's one of those fun things. I tend to tell stories one-on-one more than I do in groups. Mm-hmm. Although I have stood up at the Storyteller Circle and told stories, but it's not very often. And I usually tell a story when I am answering a question about family history. And then you have a relative who really doesn't want a long story. They just want, 2 words that will answer this question they ask. And they're like deer in the headlights. She's going to tell me, I'm here for the next 15 minutes because I asked a question. So I am learning how to tell my stories a little bit faster and more succinctly, but takes practice.
Well,
And
you can either adjust your style or find a better audience. That would be an option.
well, maybe,
It's
yeah.
family.
I have always been a listener. Well, I'm a hyperactive kid, so they used to kick me out of the door and tell me to go play somewhere else unless I could be quiet in the corner. And so I figured out when I became interested in my family history that it was better to be sitting in the corner listening. And when the relatives realized that I was actually interested, then they started sharing more stories with me. And once I went to university, I studied history and thought, well, none of this stuff my relatives are telling me is in any history books. And so that gave me the opportunity to start pursuing it. So over the years, I have pursued it. It's been interesting.
Good, dear. Good. Well, thanks for that. Our other guest is my friend and neighbor, Barb Longva. And I've met a lot of people in my many years traveling around this place, people who do all kinds of work. I have never met anyone else who makes hats for a living. How on earth, Barbara, did that come about?
Well, that came about because, I love hats and I always have. But when I first met my mother in Tarbet and I was 5 years old, she was taking sewing lessons at the time, and she was making us little tartan skirts and matching tams. And the sewing lessons were at the North River School, and we even had a fashion show and everything. And so I had an instant love of sewing doll clothes, and then hemming pants for neighbors and fixing rips and that type of thing. And then it kind of developed out of necessity. I guess I wanted to have like my own financial security. So I thought, well, I'm good at sewing. Why not make a business doing that? So I started a shop in Tarbet because my parents owned the old one-room schoolhouse in Tarbet at that time, and it could be my shop. So I renovated it, and I started sewing. And that first year we started making hats, and I just loved hats because they have so much personality. Even if they're the same style, if you have a different fabric, it can be a whole other kind of hat. So it kind of just grew, and it's taken me far and wide. I actually got to do a trade show in Milan, Italy with my business, and I got to go to England, and I got to study hat making with a woman who used to make hats for the Queen Mother. Her name is Rose Corey, and she was amazing, just down to earth, like anybody's country grandmother kind of person, and very knowledgeable. So it's been really good. And we also got to be you hear this when you come in my shop. It's my tell everybody my hat business. But we lucked out one day, and a guy from Time Magazine came in and said, I love your shop, can I take your picture? And he put us in Time Magazine. So the hat business has been really great for me, and it's 28 years old. It's the same age as my youngest child, my daughter Kirsten, and I still love it, and it's done well. And a lot of people think, well, how could you ever have like a successful hat business in the middle of the woods in Wreck Cove? But it's an international destination, so people from all over the world are driving right by my door, usually pre-COVID. So if anybody wants to check out the hats, they can check them out at soincline.ca. Give myself a little dig there.
Are you going to mention Elton John sometime during the evening?
Oh, I was leaving that for you, Bill. Yeah, I made a hat for Elton John, similar to the one I'm wearing. I wore my Mad Hatter hat tonight to give me good luck in the storytelling. Unlike Shirley, I'm not, I would never have considered myself a storyteller. But being a Cape Bretoner, I think often like someone asks you a simple question and you just, it becomes a story. Because I'm taking a workshop, a women in business workshop, and the lady we had a private call and she was asking me questions, and then I'd start, and I guess my tendency to tell a story, and she's like, okay, I don't need a story. I just need an answer.
Yeah.
And then I realized, okay, I guess I tell stories a lot.
Good. Well, you're in gear there. You want to carry on?
Mhm.
Tell me the
Well,
story.
I could tell a story about, well, coming to Tarbet when I was 5, and meeting my parents here, and they were, my mother was like this round, jovial, very kind person. And my father was, you know, he had a heart of gold too, and was a very kind person, but he was kind of scary looking to look at. He was a little bit rough around the edges, you could say, but he was very kind at the same time. And I arrived there in the summer of '65. And that year I went to school and I had got a brand new pair of red rubber boots, and they were shiny red, and they were my favorite thing. I just love them. And so I wore them to school the first day, and lo and behold, it started raining, and I was horrified that, oh no, now my new boots are going to get dirty. So at the end of the day, all the children had gone to the bus, and here I was sitting there struggling. And the teacher came out into the hall and she said, Barbara, like you have to hurry up. You're going to miss the bus. And I was there sitting there pulling my socks on over my rubber boots, which I succeeded in doing. And I arrived home from school that day with my socks over my rubber boots. And I still have one of those rubber boots at home. It's not as shiny as it used to be, but I kept one for a keepsake.
Oh,
Lovely. You have in common with Shirley that some people are looking for the short answer, but they don't get it. They have to kind of wait for a while.
yes.
Shirley, you talked about being sort of hyperactive sometime. I had a friend in Washington State, and she was like that. She said, I used to go visit my uncles on the farm, and I'd come in bustling and yapping around, and finally my uncle just put one hand on each side of my face and said, "Girl, slow down. You're making me tired." What have you
Yeah.
got, Shirley?
Yeah. Sometimes we just get it honestly. Yeah. And being from a big family, a lot of times the energy just gets stirred up and you don't know when to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have a story for us?
I sort of have one.
Sort of
It's
giver.
one that I find kind of disturbing. Uh, it's it's one I told at the Isle of Stories festival a year or two back when you had the last one. Um, I I was at home. I live here in Dartmouth. At that time, one of my sisters was living in Saskatchewan, and she was coming home for her stepdaughter's wedding in Bridgewater. But before she was going to the wedding, she wanted to go to Cape Breton for a visit. And so when she flew into Halifax, I drove her down, and we stayed with another cousin down in just outside North Sydney. And it was the week before Thanksgiving. It was one of those falls that fall hadn't started yet. Summer was going right through to Thanksgiving. And my cousin Carol decided that day that she was going to make green tomato chow. And so we did a road trip out to Boundary Island. I spent my summers on Boundary Island on the south side. I'd never been to a farmer's market on the north side, but anyway, she took me to the farmer's market, the three of us in the van, and we got quite a bit of produce to make her green tomato chow. She makes it in these great big vats. Anyway, very, very big batches. And when we got back in the car, she says, well, it's kind of warm. How about we stop at Grosse Pointe? So we stopped at Grosse Pointe, did the Cape Breton swimsuit change on the beach. I held the towel. She had a swimsuit. So anyway, she and my sister put their swimsuits on the beach, and then went out and did a swim. And they got back when we got back in the van and we're driving, my sister said, can we go to the beach in Sydney Mines? I haven't been there in a long time. Now I must explain, until I was 12, we lived in Sydney Mines. And for 10 years of that time, we lived on a property that was an old farm that my father never farmed, but anyway, it was over 50 acres just up from Lloyd's Cove. It's now becoming part of the Veterans Memorial Park. So we lived on the old farm there that wasn't a farm anymore in Sydney Mines. And we spent a lot of time on the beach. Actually, we learned how to swim down there in Sydney Mines and Lloyd's Cove. So my sister wanted to visit there. And so Cousin Carol, we drive there and parked on the parking lot off Pitt Street, because there is no way you can drive into where we used to live on the upper part of the property. And so we took our shoes off and we went for a walk along the beach. And we were heading towards the cliffs, up where those armaments are up on the cliff. And we were there with several other people, and all these other people had plastic bags with them. And they were stooping and they were picking up beach glass. That beach is noted for being one of the best for beach glass. Now, when we lived there, people didn't come to that beach to pick up beach glass. In fact, anytime we went down to that beach, we were told to look for broken glass and remove it, because it would never fail. Somebody would cut their foot on that glass. Just a couple of points away from that beach is where the dump used to be. And that's where people would back their cars up to the edge of the cliff and empty the trunk. And the glass that's on that beach is probably stuff that floated around the point and got ground up on that sand. So I'm walking there. This is just a few years ago. We lived there until 1964. So we're talking like 50 years of grinding. So I guess that beach glass is pretty safe now. You're not going to cut yourself when you pick it up anymore. So we kept walking and we get over by the cliffs, and there's a young couple there. And obviously the girl in the couple is not used to being on one of these beaches. She had fancy clothes on, she had fancy boots on, and she had a very fancy camera. So we end up chatting with them. They're newlyweds. They just got married a week earlier, and he had brought her home to where he used to live. She was from Toronto, and she was taking pictures. And what she was taking a picture of was actually one of those old-fashioned lobster traps embedded in the sand there next to the cliff, which was really neat because I hadn't seen one of those in a long time, and it just happened to be a broken one there on the beach, and she was actually taking pictures of it. So she was taking these pictures and bemoaning the fact that she couldn't see a fossil. And I'm thinking that's kind of interesting. You're in a coal mining town. You're next to cliffs where they used to mine. But anyway, we didn't argue with her. Eventually they left. And then we kind of moseyed around a bit, picking up some black stones and things. And my cousin starts bemoaning the fact she hadn't seen any fossils. And I'm saying, Carol, look down by your big toe. What do you see? And she says, oh, that's a black stone. I said, Carol, that's a piece of coal. We were standing on coal. I said, do you know what coal is? Oh. I said, those are fossils. That's part of a fossil. She says, yeah, but that's not what I mean. I want to see a fossil. I said, well, come over here. And I had been looking at the cliff, and there was this black ridge kind of sticking out from the shaly, sandy shale that was on the cliff, like that goes up there. I said, Carol, come over here. Like, what do you see here in the stone? She says, oh, that's just an old log. I said, Carol, what color is it? Black. I said, Carol, you're looking at coal. You're looking at a fossil of a tree trunk sticking out of that rock. She says, oh, I wouldn't have known. And I'm thinking, this is strange. When I was growing up, I knew about fossils. Our father worked across Pitt Street at Prince's Mine. He was an engineer in that mine. And every so often he would take this hyperactive little girl for a walk, so my mother would have her break. And he'd take his hammer and we'd go for a walk along those cliffs, and he would just take a, tap on a stone and show me where the coal was in the stones. And I just presumed that anybody who lived in Cape Breton knew about that. And it was my realization that I was probably a fossil too, knowing this stuff. It's the kind of thing, you grow up, you know it, you just presume everybody else knows it. And now I realize how important it is to share these stories of when we were growing up, so that people will know what was there before and know what they're looking at and hearing. So that's my story of storytelling.
Good. Yeah, she was looking for a T-Rex, was she, or something spectacular? Yeah.
I think she needs to go to Parsborough for that.
We welcome contributors from the sidelines, and I know we have a couple that have promised or threatened to tell stories tonight. So whenever you're ready, you can let Tara know by chat, the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't do that, we'll come and get you. Ha-ha. Do you have any nibblers yet, Tara?
No, but I saw a thumbs up, I think. So
okay, that's good. That's one I haven't learned yet, is thumbs up.
I was just looking at her picture.
All right. Well, I have a story here. This is it's a true story. Yeah, and it's also factual. That's not always the same thing, but years ago I worked with a guy named Larry. We worked at the same place, and he lived close, so we would walk to work together every morning. I only used my car probably once a week to go get groceries, and Larry was he was a first generation Canadian. His mother had no English at all. His father had some, but the language at home was Italian. And Larry was stereotypical Italian. He was about 6'1", maybe 140 pounds, big black mustache, a bushy head of Brillo hair, and a smile from all the way from here to Washabuck. And I swear if you tied his hands together, he wouldn't be able to talk. He was that kind of because he had gestures and always going on about this. Larry decided one day that we were going to go fishing. And we were not fishermen. We were not avid fishermen. I'd caught sunfish and rock bass as a kid. And on my canoe trips, I'd catch pickerel or pike or bass or sometimes a couple of muskie. But we were not avid fishermen. But Larry decided we're going fishing, and it was going to be trout fishing. So what the heck? So on Friday after work, we loaded up and went out. He said he knew this trout. I know about this trout stream. I know about this trout stream. You got to see it. And so off we went. And I'm sure when he said trout stream, and when I heard trout stream, maybe when you hear it, you think of clear rushing water and pristine wilderness and somebody standing in the middle of the creek casting a fly like this. That was not what we had. The trout stream that he knew about was if it was 2 feet deep, then with the rains had been good. It was maybe 2 meters wide at its widest point, and it ran through a field. So not quite the vacation brochure we were thinking about. And we were not alone either. The next morning was opening of trout season, so there were trailers and campers and trucks and people all over the field waiting for dawn. So we got up in the morning at first light and went fishing. And I think that for every linear meter of trout stream, there's probably 1.4 fishermen. And poor little trout would have been swimming upstream against this web of nylon, and barbed hooks and so on. We fished all day and until dark, and then got up the next morning and fished from dawn till about 1 o'clock, I guess. And somewhere there's a picture of Larry, 6'1" Larry, grinning ear to ear, holding our catch, which was one little rainbow trout, almost 4 inches long, and he caught it by the tail. The poor little thing was just trying to escape, but he had it. So at that time, I was a bit of a brat once in a while. It's a phase I went through. And Christmas, our Dorothy, who was our supervisor at work, had a Christmas party. So I went to the grocery store and I got a package of those frozen trout, the two in the package still with the heads on and everything, and I gift wrapped it for Larry. And I went to the party and he didn't show up. So, oh well, I figured I'll just take him home. So I put him back in the car when I got home and when I left. And that year, unlike the autumn that you talked about, Shirley, this spring happened overnight. I went shopping for groceries in the winter on Saturday, and when I got up Sunday, it was 15 degrees. Everything was melting, and it stayed that way right through the week. Larry and I were walking to work in our jackets, and just so and that was fine. And then on Saturday, when I went to go for shopping again, I opened the car door, and I was bowled over by a cloud of toxic fish gas that had been rotting in the back seat of my car for a week, and I guess that put me in my place. No fish for Larry.
One little fish can do a lot of damage.
Well, actually, there were two, and they worked together. I'm pretty sure. But that car, we sold it about 5 years later. It still smelled of fish on a hot day.
Oh no.
Yeah. Anybody out there with a story about bicycles that you've heard, Tara?
Yeah. So I'm going to
There's a hand up.
Kathy and Rob. So I think
Yeah.
you might have to click the unmute on your end. There we go. Okay.
Great. Thanks for this opportunity.
Kathy and Rob. Yeah, Kathy and Rob have been faithful fans for a long time, and they were here when Kathy and Art Spencer told a story about bicycling down Smoky Mountain. And Rob said, "Hey, I know a cycling story." So here we are.
A personal experience story and a little lesson learned. I'll tell you about it. So a number of years ago, Kath and I decided to sell our car. We were living in the city. I was working in the downtown, and we thought we'd save some money. And I was able to commute to work by bicycle. And after a period of time, I became very, very confident about my cycling abilities and decided to challenge myself a little bit. And so I would, set further destinations, maybe on the weekend. Eventually rode from Toronto to Midland, which was about 100 120 kilometers or something like that, to stay at my brother's place overnight and rode back. And that gave me a boost of confidence to think, like, I wonder if I could ride around Lake Ontario all by myself. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll set up a charitable, people can donate and contribute, and I'll make it a charity ride. So I had started riding, and I went through from Toronto to Niagara Falls and across the border along the south shore of Lake Ontario. Everything was just going grand. And on the fourth day, I had crossed back over at the far side of Lake Ontario into Kingston and had a nice rest in Kingston. And then I was heading westerly from Kingston back towards Toronto and feeling very, very proud of myself, thinking, what a great accomplishment I was doing. And rarely that I saw other cyclists on the road, but occasionally. And I happened to notice this one lone cyclist with a big floppy hat riding along the beautiful highway that's in an area called Prince Edward County, which is just east of Toronto, a lovely area full of cottages and small towns. And I passed her as I was riding along the highway, and I waved and said hello, did the polite thing. And I was thinking to myself, isn't that great? That nice woman out there cycling as well, probably out for a little day ride. And I decided to take a rest after about half an hour, and would you know it, oh gosh, within 15 or 20 minutes, he went by me. I said, wait a minute. Hey, that's not right. I'm an experienced cyclist. So I finished my break and I got back on my bicycle and I caught her. She was just really steady, really steady. I was actually quite impressed. And as I pulled up alongside of her, I said, hi, have you ridden very far? To which she told me, actually, I left my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I rode to my sister's in Cape Cod, and now I'm heading back home. To which, at that point, I thought, okay, maybe I'm not such a fantastic or unique cyclist after all. I congratulated her and wished her well in the remainder of her trip back to Minneapolis, Minnesota.
There's nothing like a little bit of overconfidence to make the heavens open up. Thanks, Rob. Well, are we? I forget who's next, but
I got a story.
Good.
bring it on.
Shall I tell it?
Yes.
Sure, by all means. That's why you're here. I mean, I like the hat, but we're here for your stories.
Yes, well, I was listening to almost all of your New Moon series, and I was just like, all the stories were triggering stories, like everyone I was listening to. But tonight, you telling the fishing story triggered a story, but that's just like a short one on the way to another story, which was when we moved to Tarbet, and we had these great neighbors, the Carmichaels, Clay, Rodney, and Gail. So we had, like, instant children to play with. And I spent a lot of time with Clay Carmichael because we were the same age, and he was really into outdoor adventure, and so was I. And he used to love going fishing, and so I'd always tag along, but I didn't have a real fishing rod. So I used to just take a twig, a piece of an alder, and I'd tie a string on it, and then my mother would give me a safety pin, and I'd open the safety pin and I'd put that on the end. Well, needless to say, I never caught anything, but I sure loved fishing. But that just reminded me of your fishing story. But I wanted to tell about my father, who only left Cape Breton once in his life. And I was with him that day when he left Cape Breton, and we drove across the Canso Causeway, and we turned around on the other side. I don't even know if he made it to the gas station, but he turned right around and he came right back onto Cape Breton. So at least he could say that he left Cape Breton. But for him, he went to Bedeck like once a week to get groceries and stuff, but he did not go to Sydney or North Sydney or like driving at all in those places. So when he was we used to do like an annual trip to Sydney, and we used to go with the Carmichaels next door, and that would be like back to school shopping or something. We'd get to go to like the bargain store in Sydney Mines, and that was always a big treat for us. But when my father was older, when I met him, he was 55, and probably when this happened, he may have been like around 70s. And they asked me if I would drive them to a funeral or a wake, I guess it was, in Glace Bay. So we went over to the wake in Glace Bay, and he was dressed with his three-piece suit, the vest, the tie, the suit, everything. And my mother was all dressed with her hat. And on the way, of course, at wakes, they always serve lunch and tea. So I guess he had too much tea. And on the way home, he said, well, could you pull over in between Sydney and North Sydney? So I pulled over, and he got out, and he went and found a tree. And my mother and I were sitting in the car, and we were sitting there for a long time, and he wasn't coming back. And I said, well, should I go look for him? And she was like, well, I don't know. She said, you know how he is, like, he's a very private person, and if he'd be like, well, what are you doing? Like, so we just stayed there waiting. And finally he came back, and he was wet right to his neck. And he had walked behind a tree, and there was a lake there. And he went right into the lake, right up to his neck. And he grabbed the tree on the way down, luckily, because he couldn't swim a stroke. So he managed to drag himself out and save his life somehow. So he was wild when he got back in the car. But anyway, we all survived it.
Lovely. My goodness, yes, applause by all means.
Yes.
I guess you can't see me looking at you, but I'm looking at you, Shirley.
You're looking at me, yes.
Yeah.
Well, so what kind of story would you like? Like all through my life, until I got involved with storytelling, I'm being a community volunteer, and but also the family genealogist. And part of what I've been researching is my grandmother's connection to down north, the northern part of Cape Breton.
Mm-hmm.
She was born in 1879, long before the Cabot Trail. I don't know, there must have been some wagon roads in, but she was of Newfoundland stock, part of the fisher folk that moved from Newfoundland through St. Paul's Island and then landed in Neils Harbor. And traditionally, well, the story, today I had a discussion with my cousins online about the stories we have about her. Her father died at sea before she was born. And her mother, the story is that they were probably settlers on St. Paul's Island. And after he died, she moved to Neils Harbor, where he had family, so she would be around people when she had the baby. But my aunts used to be very adamant that there was a gentleman we were not ever supposed to forget. And his name was Reverend Simon Gibbons. So you people up there down north, do you know about Simon Gibbons?
I don't. But I'm a CFA.
Anyway, he was a missionary. In 1877, the Bishop of Nova Scotia, Bishop Binney, had heard about these fisher folk that were settling in the northern part of Cape Breton. And they didn't have any religious service. Like they were Anglicans. There was a lot of Presbyterian. There was Catholics, but they didn't have any ministry in the Anglican faith. And he decided that in 1877 that a young man that was graduating from King's that's in Windsor, Nova Scotia, was the prime candidate to be a missionary to down north, the northern part of Cape Breton. And so he got the job. He settled in the year before he got married, which actually had a church. And then he set about preparing himself to go up to the northern part of the island to visit with the people. He got into a routine that he would travel for 3 weeks through northern Cape Breton to visit with the various communities. And then he would come back to Bedeque and get a rest for a week. And then he would go back and do his route. He did this summer, fall, winter, spring. And so some of the stories I've heard are quite horrendous about some of the things he did in order to carry on his mission. But he was a very amiable young man. He was well-spoken and very friendly. And he got to know everybody along the route. It didn't matter what religion they were. They became his friends, and he had several people along the route that he could just knock on the door and they would give him a meal. They could give him a bed to sleep in. That let him rest along his route. And so this is one of the little stories I heard about. There was a lighthouse keeper along the route that he used to visit, not that far from Smoky. And so it was a standing invitation. If you're in the neighborhood and you need a place to rest, please do come. So one stormy night,
Dark and stormy.
dark and stormy, snow swirling everywhere. This lighthouse keeper and his wife, the storm started in the morning. The lighthouse keeper was going about his business and he was making sure the light was trimmed and whatever. And that night, he and his wife were preparing to go to bed, and she had already crawled into bed. And then he decided he had to get dressed again. And she says, "What in the world are you doing? It's bedtime." I have the what do they call him? The person is calling me. The person needs me. She says, "Don't be silly. He went by last week. He's not coming through again for another 2 weeks. Just go to bed and we'll deal with things in the morning." He says, "No, I cannot sleep. The person is calling me." So anyway, he got dressed, he called his dog, and they went out into the storm. Of course, the wife gets up, she puts on the stove and puts on the kettle because when he gets back, he's going to be cold no matter what. But anyway, the lighthouse keeper and his dog walk up Smoky, and they come across snowshoe tracks in the snow. And the snowshoe tracks, it's obvious, it's whoever made them is lost. They're going around in circles, they're going every which way and backtracking. So anyway, the lighthouse keeper follows the tracks until he comes to the edge of a cliff, and the tracks stop. So he and his dog make his way down the side to the bottom, and there Simon Gibbons is lying with his knapsack in the snow. He had fallen off the cliff. So the lighthouse keeper gently picked up the parson and carried him back to the house, where they put him to bed and warmed him up. A day or two later, he thanks them very kindly and continues on his way. That was the kind of gentleman that was the missionary to those people up north.
Oh, good one. Good story. Yeah. You mentioned St. Paul's Island. I knew about that only from when I drove the tour bus around the trail, and it's I think it's about 40 kilometers off the shore. and it's not a big place. It's only about 3 miles long, and there's a lighthouse there. But there are over 1,500 bodies buried there.
Yeah.
Because the ships that crossed the Atlantic from Europe, if they had people die on the way, they would stop and bury them on St. Paul's Island. So
Yes.
I hadn't heard about settlers there. There's
Well,
lots I haven't heard about yet.
from what I've heard, legally there was no settlers except the Lighthouse Keeper.
Yeah.
But the fisher folk would, well, they come from Newfoundland. They were fishing off the island. They would settle there.
Mhm.
And I've heard stories of families where a plague ship would go by and, well, the bodies would have been brought ashore, and there would be epidemics of the among the fisher folk from looking after the bodies.
Wow.
So it was a hard life. As far as I understand, my grandmother's father died around January. So it could have been one of those storms where they would just be off the shore.
Yeah.
But anyway, her mother survived and went to Neils Harbor. So I'm still here. I'm here today.
Good, dear, good. Barb, do you have another story there before I break out into poetry, as sometimes happens here? It's an affliction.
Um, I do. Well, talking about, I guess I'll have a little bit of a history before I have another little funny one. But my father was born in 1910 and my mother was born in 1916, and so they lived through the Depression. And my mother grew up in Tarbet Vale, up on the hill there, and she was a little girl. Both her parents had died when she was a baby, and so she was raised by her grandmother, and she had 5 uncles, I think. So it was this little woman, and she told me one time that, like, when they lived through the Depression, they had sheep, and she sheared and carded and spun and wove and made clothes out of flour bags, and it was just amazing what she did. And one time she made a coat for a little girl by taking apart an old coat that she had and turning it inside out and cutting out a smaller one and sewing it back together for this little girl that was in need of a coat. So it was, she was just like, she could make something out of nothing. And I was always amazed by that growing up there, how she did that. But I was listening today, a story that Daniel told about getting pooped on by a bird. and
Yes.
and I had the same experience, and I was so happy to hear that it's lucky. So my experience was when I was I guess I was 15 years old, and I had gone over to City Mines to the new school, the Memorial High School. It was the first year it was open. And so I met a boy not long after I arrived in North Sydney, and we were dating. So this day I was going to go get a haircut, and he drove me to my hair appointment, and I got my hair cut into what they call the shag, and I thought I looked pretty darn good. And I came out of the salon, and he was sitting there with his elbow sticking out the window, looking at me, and I was looking at him. And I came out just from underneath the edge of the roof, and just as I did, I felt something wet on my nose, and I rubbed my nose, and there was a big seagull poop right on my nose, and I was just like that. I always said that was my lesson in vanity.
Yes, that was Daniel McGuire. He's a transplanted Irishman here now.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm. Thank you, Barb. I'm. I'm reminded sometimes of the power of words and the power of stories. This I've always been a fan of rhyming poetry as a storytelling tool, and this is maybe the one that hooked me on that method. But Kate Oland, who runs the library in Quebec, she and I do some music together. So she was out on the book pavilion one day in Neils Harbor, and I went up and we went to the manor there, to the seniors' residence. And we had a mutual friend there, Bob, and he had had some pretty severe strokes, and he was bedridden. He had no speech, he had no mobility. He was just kind of hanging on and waiting to die, you know. And they brought his bed out, and he sat in a circle with the other people. But then I announced that I was going to do this poem, and he just about jumped out of the bed. It's the first animation anybody'd seen from him in ages. His eyes lit up and his head was bouncing around. And when I said I was going to do this story, and it reminded me again, you know, these words matter, and they matter quite a bit. So this is a story, and I'll tell you about it a little bit later. But if you know this, you're welcome to join in by all means. Oh, one more button to push here before this.
Bill, before you start, is this where you want people to join? So I'll unmute boxes?
No,
No,
that
not
would
this-
be
okay,
that
sorry.
would be the song. If we
Okay,
decide
sorry.
we're going to do a song,
Okay, sorry.
we will. But that's not now, because there are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold, and the Arctic trails have their secret tales that will make your blood run cold. The northern light and queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was one night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was in Tennessee where the cotton blooms and grows. Why he left his home in the south to roam round the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to grip him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way, "I'd rather live in hell." Christmas Day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold, through the parka's fold it stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd close, the lashes froze. Sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And late that night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed, and the stars o'erhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me and, "Cap," says he, "I'll cash in this trip, I guess. If I do, I'm asking you won't refuse my last request." Well, he seemed so low that I couldn't say no. Then he said with a sort of moan, "It's the cursed cold. It's got right hold till I'm chilled clean to the bone. Yet it ain't being dead. It's my awful dread of the icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear, foul or fair, you'll cremate my last remains." Well, the pal's last need is a thing to heed, so I swore I would not fail, and we started on at the crack of dawn, but God, he looked ghastly pale. He crouched in the sleigh and he raved till he his home in Tennessee. Before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left to Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in that land of death as I hurried, horror driven, with the corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, "You may dash of brawn and brain, but your promise true. Now it's up to you to cremate these last remains." And every day, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern code. In the days to come, though my lips were dumb, in my heart how I cursed that load. In the long cold night by the lone firelight, where the huskies round in the ring howled out their woes to the frozen snows, my God, how I loathed that thing. And every day that quiet clay seemed to heavy and heavier grow, and on I went, though the dogs were spent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad and I felt half mad, but I swore I'd not give in. I often sing to the hateful thing, and it would hearken with a grin. Until I came to the marge of Lake Labarge, and a derelict there lay. She was jammed in the ice, and I saw in a trice it was called the Alice May. I looked at it, and I thought a bit, and I looked at my frozen chum, and "Here," says I with a sudden cry, "is my crematorium." Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Coal I found was laying around, and I heaped the flames up higher. The flames just roared and the furnace soared, such a blaze you seldom see, and then I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal. I stuffed in Sam McGee. And I took a hike, for I did not like to hear him sizzle so, and the heavens scowled and the huskies howled and the wind began to blow. It was icy cold, but the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks, and I don't know why, and the icy smoke in an achy cloak went streaking down the sky. do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out and they danced out. There again I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, I'll just take a peek inside. I guess he's cooked, and it's time I looked. And the door I opened wide. And there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. He wore a smile, you could see a mile. He says, please shut that door. It's fine in here, but I greatly fear you'll let in the cold and the storm. It's a plum tree down in Tennessee. It's the first time I've been warm. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold, and the Arctic trails are secret tales that will make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was one night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee.
Wow.
Jeez.
Well done.
I did not know until recently. I found out when we did Dan McGrew the last time that it was based on an actual person, and so was the cremation of Sam McGee. And I had no clue. There is a Lake Laberge, south of Dawson City, and he called it Lake Labarge. There was indeed a ship that was abandoned there. It was a sternwheeler called the Olive May, and he changed that to the Alice May. And there was indeed a William Samuel McGee, who was a road builder, but he was also a prospector. And Service worked at a bank in Whitehorse, and he saw the name McGee on one of the forums, and he picked it to rhyme with Tennessee. And what is the other one? Oh, there was a fellow named Dr. Sugden, I think. And when he was out on the ice, and there was a fellow that died of pneumonia. His name was Cornelius Curtin. And so Sugden cremated him in the boiler of the Olive May and sent the ashes to his family in Tennessee.
Mm.
So how do
Wow.
you like them apples?
Yeah.
I'm amazed you can remember all those words and just rhyme them right out of your head.
Yeah, well, you should see me with a recipe, though. See, Kathy Murray has her hand up here again, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Mhm.
You have to unmute again, Catherine, or be unmuted.
Oh, sorry, I might have to do something there. Okay.
There's something there.
I was just thumbs up into your story. That's all.
Oh no, I'm sure you were going to tell a tale, or were you not?
Okay. So, I told this story, wrote this story when Bill and I were in a writers group together, and it's kind of a funny story, a little personal, but I don't care if you know my personal story. So years ago, I had to have some pretty difficult medical testing done, and I was at the clinic and have to get undressed, and I was very, very nervous, and I took my clothes off quickly, and I put the gown on and went through some uncomfortable times, and I was just so anxious to get out of there when I was done that I just pulled my pants up and put my top on and my coat and scarf, it was winter, and headed out and took the bus and the subway to get to a big mall, shopping mall in Toronto, where I was going to get picked up. Rob was going to pick me up later. And so anyways, I had been really distracted in discomfort on the trip over there. But I thought to make myself feel better, I would go to the pet store. So at that time, there was a pet store, and they used to then, they don't now, but they would sell puppies and kittens in the store. So I thought that'll get my mind off it. I'll look at all these little puppies, and they had stacked cages. So I looked at the ones that were eye level, and then I looked at the ones a little bit lower, and then I crouched down to see the ones at the bottom. And as I did, I noticed something that was coming out of the bottom on the floor. I thought it was on the floor at first, and I realized it's coming out of the bottom of my pants. And I realized what it was, that in my haste to pull my pants up with my underwear, I obviously get my legs in properly. And there was my underwear, and I worked its way down to hanging below my pants. I was so wondering, first of all, how long has it been hanging there? Is everyone on the bus and everywhere else? But beyond that, I thought, how am I going to get rid of it now? Because it's a really crowded store, and I don't necessarily have the strongest legs to crouch that long, but I was down there thinking, how am I going to get rid of these? So I carefully pulled them out and went out from underneath the bottom of my boot, and then tried to put them up into my sleeve, and then moved them to go into my pocket. And just as I was putting it in my pocket and going to stand up, I noticed the store clerk watching. I thought, holy cow, what am I going to do? How am I going to explain this? Because I assumed he looked like I was stealing something. And I thought, what's worse, if he thinks I'm stealing something, or I have to pull out my underwear to prove that I have? So, anyway, as it was, I worked my way out of the store, and no big hand came on my shoulder. They obviously didn't think I was stealing, and out I went, very embarrassed, and but I saved myself, and I didn't get caught. So anyways, that's my silly story.
Good one.
That's probably about as personal as it's going to get tonight, I hope.
Well, next time, Bill, you know I have a bra one with my grandfather. Another time.
Another time, yes. That's, well. Well, thanks,
So, by the way, a little added prop. I don't know. I don't know if you can see this or not. Speaking about puppies in the pet store.
Oh.
Spencer J. Murray, yes.
Spencer Murray, yeah.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for that. Yeah. We haven't heard from the other tag team that we usually hear from. I know they're here. Good for you, dear. Anything from the other Spencers? The dog is named Spencer, by the way.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. No other shares.
Okay.
Someone had to leave and said, thanks for sharing. Lovely time.
Okay. I had a thought and it flew away into the dark. Oh, yes, I was going to say, yeah. I keep asking Tara if she's going to contribute a story, and she says, well, maybe at the Blue Moon. So that'll be in August, just so you know. Oh, yes. You think I wouldn't follow up?
I know. I didn't even look at a calendar. All right, Bill, come August. I'll be ready. You know what? Art does have a poem. Sorry, so I'm a little slow on the emails here, but I can unmute Art and Kathy and just have to find. There we go.
Okay, so we'll go from.
I think you're ready to go.
We're ready.
We'll go from Spencer the dog to Spencer the art. Hi,
okay.
Good to see you again.
This is just very, very short story / poem from my childhood. It's when a lot of kids in the neighborhood, particularly boys, and it's one of those things when you're about 10 years old, kind of sticks in your head, and it's just kind of one of opposites. So here we go. One bright day in the middle of the night, two dead boys got up to fight. Back to back, they faced each other, drew their swords and shot each other. The deaf policeman heard the noise, came and shot the two dead boys. Now, if you don't believe this lie is true, ask the blind man. He saw it too. There.
Yes.
Excellent.
My father had a trunk full of things like that, little sayings like that. Yes. Oh, well, if we're on silly poems, this is one I heard from the mother of my friend in St. John, New Brunswick, probably 50 years ago. What a curious bird the frog are. When he sit, he stand almost. When he hop, he fly almost. Ain't got no sense hardly. Ain't got no tail hardly neither. when he sits on what he ain't got, almost. Ta-da. I forget which of our guests is next, but go ahead, whoever you are.
I have one.
All right, dear.
It's sort of inspired by one of the tellers you had a couple of months ago, around November, probably. It's about an event that happened in 1929, I believe it was, in November. The person I'm going to tell the point of view of is my Uncle Charlie. Well, actually, my mother's Uncle Charlie. He's my grandfather's brother. He was a teenager at the time. He lived in Port Caledonia, there in across the channel from Glace Bay. And they lived in a house that was just up on a cliff just above the sandbar there. And at that time, the road ran by that house and down to the sandbar, around a lake, and then back to the sandbar. And then the road continued across to Glace Bay by way of a narrow suspension bridge to South Street, and then into the main part of the town. Now, my uncle, his father was working the mines, but Charlie got a job at a garage over in Glace Bay. And he always liked cars. Now, I don't know what kind of car he was driving in the 1920s, but anyway, after he'd been working for a time at the garage, he managed to buy himself a car. And he was very excited about that. So one day he's at work, and he had driven himself to work with his fancy car. And his boss came in and he says, Charlie, I'm going to trade vehicles with you this evening. You're going to take the company truck home because I'm going to borrow your car. I have a date tonight. And she doesn't really want to go on a date in the truck. So you get the truck, I get the car. So Charlie really didn't have a choice. He was about 18 at the time. You don't argue with the boss. So they worked the day. Around supper time, there was a bit of a shuddering all over the place. They weren't quite sure if that was what was going on, but it didn't last long. That was fine. Around 7:30, well, before 7:30, garage closed. Charlie gets in the company truck and he heads for home down South Street. And just about 7:30, he's on the bridge crossing to the sandbar. And he had noticed that the tide seemed to be out awfully far. And he could see a wall of water coming. So he kind of sped up. This is kind of unusual. But he hadn't quite got off the bridge when a tidal wave came in and swept across the bridge. And he continued driving as the water kept coming in. He looked outside of the windows of the truck. He could see fish jumping in this water that's flowing by, looking quite excited. But he continued on the road along the sandbar, determined if the water was coming up, but it didn't seem to have hit the engine yet. So as long as the truck was going, he was going to keep going. And he managed to stay on the road and made his way safely home. This was November 1929. There had been an earthquake on the Grand Banks, and this was the tidal wave that had been generated by the earthquake. I think it was November the 18th. And it caused an awful lot of damage to southern Newfoundland at the time. I was not aware that it actually had made it to Cape Breton. And it was many years later, I learned the story of my Uncle Charlie. And I learned the story in connection with another tidal wave tsunami that happened at Christmas time a few years ago. At that time, my cousin Rolly's sister's husband called our house to inform us that Rolly's daughter was okay. This is the day after the major earthquake that caused all that damage that Christmas Day in the Pacific. And I'm talking to Kirk and I'm saying, well, Kirk, I'm glad to know she's okay. What's going on? He says, well, she's in Mali. She's on one of the islands in the Pacific that has been affected by the tsunami. She was there with her 1-year-old. She was on the second floor of her apartment building and watched the wave sweep over the island that she's on. Her island's 3 meters above sea level, but she was okay. And her husband's okay. He had already taken off. He was a helicopter pilot and he was already doing rescues. And Kirk is saying, you know, this is an awful lot like the stories Charlie used to tell us. And I said, what stories are there? The only story I had ever heard about for this earthquake was in connection on my father's side of the family. My grandfather, at the time of the shaking that happened earlier in the day, my dad's sisters had started complaining that the boys were probably outside being roughhousing and throwing things against the house, and they were getting quite upset. And my grandfather said, no, this is an earthquake. Grab the baby, that was my Uncle David, and get outside, because Granddad had been in Africa during the Boer War and had experienced earthquakes, and he was actually aware of it. So that was the only reason I knew that the earthquake had been felt in the Glace Bay area. But here I am on the phone talking to Charlie's son-in-law about one of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren surviving another one. And it's really neat how the family stories come together, but you have to hear about them by accident. So that's my little story about tidal waves hitting Glace Bay. That bridge, they think that was the last vehicle to have crossed that bridge at the time of the tidal wave. After that, the bridge was no longer stable enough to carry any cars, and they had to find alternative routes to Glace Bay, and the bridge was never replaced. I think they had a swinging bridge for people to walk to get to the mines a little faster, but otherwise, the sandbar was not stable enough to hold a suspension bridge again. So it's kind of interesting how in a moment, things change so much.
Yes. It's always fascinating at these things too, how one story will lead to another. I've told this before. We did a presentation with Hector, not Carmichael, he's dead. Hector McNeil at the Playhouse in Louisburg, which is set behind me. And I talked to Hector after. He said, you know, I came with a dozen stories ready. He said, I told 2 of them because you said something about a horse, and then I said something about a horse and had a dog in it, and you had a dog story, and that's happened a couple of times tonight already, isn't it? Kind of fun. Now, I had a thought. Jeez, I wish I had better notes or possibly a more functioning memory. Oh yes, this is a little trucking story. I was on the highway for several years. I did 1.6 million highway miles in a big truck. And one of my friends was Doug Fraser. We called him the Mighty Fluffy. And he'd been around trucks all his life. His father drove, and I think Doug was driving truck illegally when he was about 16. And he became a mechanic, and he owned trucking companies and owned his own trucks, and he just knew everything about them from start to finish, but he wasn't good at backing up. The most difficult thing about learning to drive a big truck is that it doesn't work like a car when you back up. It works the exact opposite. And so whenever we were anywhere together, I would put his truck in for him. And he didn't mind. He knew how good he wasn't. But he was in Chicago one time, he told me about it, and he was by himself, and the place he had to go to, the loading dock was underneath the building, so he had to back down the ramp about 250 feet inside the building. And they had concrete dividers between each of the lanes so you didn't get too lost in there, because going from bright daylight to darkness is tricky too. So he pulled up and he thought, I'm going to be here till Easter. Oh well, I got to do it. So he wiggled around. He was up and down probably 25 minutes it took him to get backed in, and pulling, getting crooked and a little, and straightening out and going back again. And he finally bumped the dock and set the brakes and said, I'm glad that's over with. So we got out and went back to watch the loading, and he had forgotten to open his doors. And so we had to pull out and do the whole thing all over again. That was the mighty Fluffy. What you got, Barb?
Well, I was just earlier when I was listening to the stories of other weeks, and you were mentioning about the connection between the Boston States and Cape Breton, where people from Cape Breton used to go to the Boston States to work years ago, where now a lot of people go to the West Coast. But my mother's two sisters and an uncle, all in the same family, they all moved to Jamaica Plain. And so one year, well, my mother, I was also thinking about all the wakes we had at our house, because that was like a traditional thing to do, to wake people who had died. So my mother was a caregiver, and she looked after her grandmother till she died. Then she looked after her uncles, and when they died, they were waked in our house. But one year, one of my aunts from Boston had come home with her husband, Chris and Bert, and I think it was my uncle Murdoch had taken ill, so he was staying at our house. So we only had two bedrooms, our bedroom where me and Karen slept, and their bedroom. So of course, because my aunt and uncle were home, my mother and father gave up their bedroom, and they slept on the couch. So, but they had moved their bed into our room. So normally me and Karen were in one bed, and my mother and father were in the other bed in the same little room. And my sick uncle was in their room in a hospital bed. So when the aunt and uncle came home, they gave their bed up. And my little sister had a habit every night of, in the middle of the night when she'd wake up, she'd scurry over and climb right in between my mother and father. And she was like maybe 3 or 4 years old. And this night she forgot that it was my aunt and uncle that were in that bed. So she scurried over in the middle of the night. And my aunt Chris woke up and she's like, Bert, there's someone in bed with us. And my uncle Bert, of course, as soon as Karen heard that, she scurried back to her bed as fast as possible. So by the time Uncle Bert woke up, she was already back in her bed, and he was like, oh, don't be crazy, Chris. There's no one in bed with us. The short, snappy one. And then I had another short one that I had thought was kind of cute, because I'm kind of an independent person, and I was always independent from the get-go. So when I was 5, I was going to school at North River, and I had met this friend, Kathy Carr from North River, and we became best buds in school. And so one day, me and her decided that it would be a good idea if I went to her place after school, but no one else knew about the plan, just us. So we walked up there after school, and I didn't get on the bus, and the teacher, nobody noticed, I think, until we got to Kathy's place. And then her mother was in shock, and she was like, what are you doing here? And I was like, oh, well, I just thought it'd be a good idea to come and visit. She said, well, I don't think, your mother doesn't know, and this is not a good thing. And so I took off and started walking. And I was only 5 or 6, maybe. I walked across the North River Bridge I was up the Meadow Road. I walked across the North River Bridge. I walked partway up the Church Hill. And then a truck pulled up beside me and this man was in it. Unlike today, like people tell their kids not to get into strange vehicles, but I got in the truck and I looked at the man and I said, I'm going to Dan Hector Smith's house. And he looked at me and he goes, oh, I know where you're going. Because everybody had called him and told him to go and get me because there's this little girl like gonna walk like 3 miles to home, which wasn't anything in my mother's day. But anyway, he picked me up and he drove me to the door because my father was working and my mother didn't have a car and didn't drive at the time.
Cool. Well, you mentioned North River Bridge, and that makes me think of Duncan and Chrissy McEachern, of course, down there. And we had a project for the North Shore Gaelic Heritage Society a few years ago and interviewed them as part of our I think we had 62 hours of interviews recorded with local people. Really good stuff. And we asked Duncan, where are you from? He said, right here, he says. I was born right here and I went to school across the other side of North River Bridge and it's been my whole life here except for 2 weeks when I went to Toronto and didn't like it and came home. and said, and Chrissy, where are you from? Oh, I'm not from here, she said. No, where are you from? Tarbert, she said. 3 kilometers down the road. These things matter. Well, my dear friends, this has been a lovely evening again, and I think unless stories rain from the sky, we're about to fold up the tents and clean the cages. Yeah. Thanks to Rob and Kathy for their stories, and Spencer J. Murray for watching, and to Shirley Godfrey from Dartmouth, and Councillor Barb Longva from here in Wreck Cove. And Tara, my dear, once again, we're looking forward to the blue moon in August when we hear your story.
Time to prepare. All right, I'll get it ready.
If you'd like to see the story, the episodes that have gone before, it's cbrl.ca/New Moon Stories, and we have all 7 episodes, and we'll have this one on probably within a week, I hope. So, friends and neighbors, aloha.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night, everybody.
Oh, Art, I forgot your poem. Thank you, Art.